press conference started like any other post-game event, cameras rolling, reporters settling into their seats, that familiar quiet that fills a room before someone decides to tell the truth. Stephanie White sat at the table with her team around her, ready for the standard questions and standard answers that usually follow a loss. But this wasn't going to be standard. Caitlin Clark sat right there next to her coach, and before a single question was even asked, you could read everything on her face. The frustration, the exhaustion, that unmistakable look that says someone's reached their breaking point with pretending everything is fine. One broadcaster watching the live feed described Clark as looking extremely frustrated and visibly irritated. Another said she was rolling her eyes at the scoreboard, still processing everything that had gone wrong. She hadn't even started talking yet, but her body language was already delivering a message louder than any words could. And when she finally opened her mouth, what came out would confirm what millions of viewers had suspected about the state of this Indiana Fever team. This wasn't some hidden conflict buried behind closed doors. This was real-time frustration boiling over in front of everyone, directed at the person controlling her minutes, her role, and her team's entire offensive system. The tension in that room was suffocating. The cameras caught every bit of it. And what happened next would define not just this game, but potentially the entire season's narrative for a franchise that was supposed to have everything it needed to compete. Before we get to the post-game moment that changed everything, you need to understand what happened in the opening 12 minutes of this game against Atlanta. Because that first quarter wasn't just good basketball, it was a showcase of what generational talent looks like when it's operating without limitations. Caitlin Clark came out absolutely on fire, 13 points in the first quarter alone, 5 of 6 from the field, 3 of 4 from three-point range. But if you reduce what happened in those opening 12 minutes to just numbers, you're missing the entire point of what was actually unfolding on the court. This wasn't about padding stats or running up a score against a depleted defense. This was about complete and total offensive control. This was about a player operating at a level where every single decision she made was the right one, and every defender tasked with stopping her was basically just hoping something would go wrong on its own. Every time the Atlanta Dream tried to throw a double team at Clark, she'd already seen it coming before they even committed to it. The ball was gone, already in flight, already finding a cutter in rhythm or hitting a teammate who was open because she'd created space for them milliseconds earlier. The timing was impeccable. The decision-making was borderline supernatural. She wasn't just playing basketball in those moments. She was reading an open book and turning the pages before everyone else in the arena even knew there was a book in the room. But here's what made it genuinely scary. It wasn't just the scoring, it was the pace. Clark was pushing tempo before Atlanta's defense could even reset. Every possession felt like it was moving at lightning speed. Indiana would score, grab the rebound, and before Atlanta could think about getting organized defensively, Clark was already spotting an open player or creating space for herself. The Dream had absolutely no answer for any of it. Their defensive schemes were built for a slower, more controlled game. But Clark was playing at a tempo that completely dismantled everything Atlanta had prepared, everything they'd practiced, everything they thought would work. Indiana put up 39 points in that opening quarter. 39. That's a season high for scoring in a single quarter. Think about that for a second. In 12 minutes of basketball before halftime, before any adjustments, before the game had even really started, Indiana had already put up more points than most teams score in an entire half. And they did it with such efficiency and ease that the Atlanta Dream looked completely lost on both ends of the floor. They looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The broadcasters covering the game couldn't believe what they were watching. One analyst literally said the defenders looked like they were on the verge of tears, and that wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. That was actual fear. That was professionals witnessing something at a level they couldn't contain or control. Another broadcaster mentioned Clark was smiling, happy as hell, hitting threes, completely in her element. The contrast between her expression and the expressions on Atlanta's defenders told you everything about what was happening. One team was experiencing basketball the way it was meant to be played. The other team was watching it happen to them. If you actually extrapolate Clark's first quarter efficiency across a full 40-minute game, she's hitting 52 points. 52. In a game where she maintained the shooting percentage she displayed in those first 12 minutes, she'd be putting up one of the greatest scoring performances in WNBA history. And the scary part, everyone watching knew she wasn't even done yet. She wasn't going to get tired. She wasn't going to cool off because Atlanta made adjustments. She was locked in at a level where the only thing that could stop her was a coaching decision to take her off the floor. It was the only variable that mattered at that point. By the end of that first quarter, Clark had 19 points and 5 assists with only 2 turnovers, 19 and 5 in 12 minutes. Indiana was up 11 points, not barely ahead, not clinging to a small lead. They were up by 11 against a professional team that's supposed to be competitive in the WNBA. And everyone in that arena, everyone watching on screens at home, everyone who understood basketball knew exactly why. It wasn't because of role players stepping up and having the games of their lives. It wasn't because Atlanta was just playing badly, though they were. It was because Caitlin Clark was controlling the entire game from the opening tip. She was orchestrating, she was deciding, she was determining what happened on every single possession. Indiana looked like they could beat anybody in the WNBA that night. They looked like a championship team. They looked completely and utterly dominant. And it was entirely because Clark was operating at a level where she wasn't just scoring. She was orchestrating the entire offense. This is what happens when a coach lets Caitlin Clark do what Caitlin Clark was actually drafted to do. This is what the offense looks like when she's unleashed instead of managed and constrained. This is what the Fever are genuinely capable of when they build around their best players' strengths instead of trying to force them into a system that doesn't fit.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
The 2026 window for this Indiana Fever team is legitimately real. This isn't hype. This isn't media speculation about a young team with potential. This is just basketball reality. This is what happens when you have a generational talent in her prime years. This is what you have when you have a player operating at a superstar tier on a roster with enough complementary pieces to actually compete for something serious. Caitlin Clark is playing at a level where an MVP run isn't a fantasy. It's a legitimate possibility. She's operating at a superstar tier. She has the skill, she has the competitiveness, she has the basketball IQ, she has the ability to elevate every single person around her. The Fever have enough talent around her to compete for something serious. Kelsey Mitchell when she's healthy, Aliyah Boston when she's not in foul trouble. Pieces that, if assembled correctly, can absolutely be part of a winning team. Pieces that matter. But every game where Stephanie White treats Clark's strengths as things to manage rather than build around is a game Indiana hands to the other team before the opening tip. Every substitution that removes her during a scoring run, every lineup that doesn't maximize her playmaking, every third quarter where the system gets tightened instead of unleashed, all of those are games being lost by choice. Not by the other team being better, not by the opponent outplaying you, but by coaching decisions that actively work against your best player, that actively prevent her from operating at her highest level, that actively handicap your team. Clark put up 26 points and 7 assists in this loss. That's a solid game for most players. For a generational talent on pace for 52 points in the first quarter, for someone who was reading Atlanta's defense perfectly in that opening 12 minutes, it's a missed opportunity. She did that despite the substitution pattern, not because of it. She did that while watching the refs gift Atlanta 31 free throws. She did that while Atlanta got to play physical and Indiana had to play tentative. She did that despite all of it. And then she sat next to her coach on camera while she and Cunningham said exactly what they thought about how things are being managed. Said it in a way that's professional but clear, in a way that nobody can misunderstand, in a way that creates a record of dissatisfaction that can't be erased or forgotten. The question now is whether anything actually changes, whether White reconsiders how she uses her best player, whether the system gets built around Clark's strengths instead of trying to constrain them. Whether the bench rotation gets adjusted to put more minutes on the players actually performing, whether Sophie Cunningham gets more opportunities to play at the pace she thrives at, whether Aliyah Boston gets protection from cheap foul calls, whether the approach to the game changes fundamentally to match what actually works, whether the post-game moment from this game becomes a turning point or just another example of tension that gets papered over without actually being addressed. Because if it doesn't change, then this post-game moment becomes the first real crack in what was supposed to be a playoff-ready team. The first sign that something's fundamentally broken. Cracks like that don't just disappear. They spread, they metastasize, they create cultures where players start questioning whether the coaching staff is actually aligned with winning. They create doubt, they create distance between coach and players. And once that question starts getting asked, once it's voiced in public, once there's a record of it, it's very difficult to put back in the bottle. Very difficult to undo. The trust that was there gets harder to rebuild. The communication that should flow between coach and players gets more strained. The doubt that players have about whether the coach believes in them starts to grow. White acknowledged after the game that Indiana's foul problems come from players being late and out of position. That's her describing a coaching problem out loud without seeming to realize it. Those positioning issues aren't the players' fault. They're systems issues, they're preparation issues. They're the result of how the offense is being structured and how the defense is being taught to operate. That's coaching, that's on White, that's her responsibility. But she's describing it like it's the players' fault. Like they're making mistakes when really they're executing a system that puts them in bad positions. That puts them at a disadvantage. So now the Fever are in a situation where their best player is frustrated. Their key bench contributors are frustrated, the fans are frustrated, and the coach is responding by acknowledging problems without seeming willing to address them. That's not a recipe for success. That's not how you fix things. That's a recipe for a team that spirals, for culture that breaks down, for a window that closes faster than it should. Clark's not going anywhere. She's a franchise player in the truest sense. She's going to keep showing up and trying to win. She's going to keep putting in the work. She's going to keep bringing competitiveness and intensity and excellence to every game. But there's a difference between showing up and being fully bought in. There's a difference between trying to win and being completely aligned with the program. There's a difference between playing hard and having full confidence in the system you're operating within. And the gap between those two things can grow quickly when a player feels like the system they're operating within is working against them instead of for them. When a player feels like the coaching is constraining them, when a player watches their coach make substitutions that don't make sense, when a player sits on the bench and watches momentum disappear, that gap grows, it spreads, it metastasizes into something that's harder and harder to fix. The 2026 window won't stay open forever. That's just a basketball reality. Young players develop and get better. Other teams get better. Rosters change. Windows close. They don't stay open indefinitely. And right now, Indiana has a window that should be wide open, should be thriving, should be taking advantage of everything they have available. Clark is at a point in her career where she could be leading a team to a championship run. She's talented enough. She's smart enough. She's competitive enough. She has everything it takes. But she can't do that if the coaching is actively working against her, if the system is constraining her, if the rotation decisions are removing her when she's hot, if the approach changes the moment she gets effective. What happened in that post-game press conference was important because it was real, it was honest. It was two players saying what they actually think instead of what they think they're supposed to say. And in a world where most people in sports just give canned answers and hide behind coach speak, honesty like that matters. It means something, but honesty only matters wants her to do. That's the choice that's available. That's what's on the table. That decision is on White. And based on what we saw in this game, based on the post-game comments, based on the season-long pattern of substitution decisions and system constraints, based on how White responded to the criticism instead of they weren't executing intricate plays what they were running was simple, fast, dynamic, and completely effective. An offense with Clark at the center making decisions in space before defenses could respond. Before Atlanta's players could even think about what was happening next, the spacing was clean. The ball movement was constant. Possessions were moving at a pace where Atlanta simply couldn't organize themselves defensively. By the time they'd reset, Indiana had already scored or gotten the ball to another open player. It was like watching someone solve a puzzle before you even realized there was a puzzle to solve. Every cut was happening at the right time. Every pass was finding someone in rhythm. Every decision was being made with perfect information because Clark was reading everything happening on the court faster than Atlanta's defense could execute their plans. This is what transition basketball looks like when it's being run by someone with Clark's IQ and vision. Not chaotic, not out of control, but fast-paced and purposeful and devastating to defend. Indiana was pushing pace constantly. Not after every possession, but frequently enough that Atlanta never felt comfortable, never felt like they could get set, never felt like they could implement the defensive scheme they'd spent time preparing. The three-point line was being used properly, not to pad stats, but to spread the floor and create driving lanes. Atlanta's interior players couldn't help on drives because shooters were spread out everywhere. Clark was creating advantages by making the floor wider, making it impossible for Atlanta to defend everything at once. This is basketball at its purest form, not about who can execute the most complicated system, but about who can play faster and smarter and make better decisions than their opponent. And for one quarter, it was absolutely beautiful to watch. It was the kind of basketball that makes you understand why Clark was drafted first overall, why she was supposed to be a generational talent. Why expectations for this franchise were astronomical entering the season. One quarter of basketball against Atlanta showed you everything that was possible. It showed you the ceiling. It showed you what this team could be with the right system and the right approach and the right coaching decisions backing it up. The second quarter came and went without much fanfare. Nobody really talks about the second quarter because it wasn't dramatic or shocking or noteworthy. But Indiana kept building on their lid. Clark kept cooking. The transitions kept flowing. The offense kept moving at that perfect pace where Atlanta's defense couldn't get organized, couldn't do anything but watch as Indiana extended their advantage further and further. By the time you got to halftime, Indiana was in complete control. They'd set a season scoring record in the first quarter. Now they were just sustaining it, not letting the dream back into the game, not getting complacent, just continuing to execute at a high level. The third quarter started, and for the first few minutes, it looked like the same story was going to continue uninterrupted. Clark had 19 points and 5 assists, still in rhythm, still in complete control. The defense was still scrambling. Indiana's momentum was still building. Everything was pointing toward a dominant second half. And then something happened that changed absolutely everything about this game. At the 8:41 mark of the third quarter, right after a Monique Billings foul, Stephanie White made a decision that would define the rest of the night. She pulled Caitlin Clark from the floor. No injury, no foul trouble. No obvious tactical reason to take your best player off the court in the middle of a game where she'd been literally the only reason Indiana was ahead. No clear explanation for why you'd remove the person who was running your offense perfectly and controlling every possession. The Fever were up 5 points at that moment. Clark was playing with the kind of confidence and rhythm that only happens once every few games if you're lucky. The offense was moving, the ball was swinging, players were getting open looks, everything was working, everything was functioning at a high level, and White benched her anyway, right there, in the middle of a close game. With momentum on Indiana's side, then White got into an animated exchange with Clark on the sideline. Whatever was said in that moment, it was serious enough that White felt compelled to pull her starting point guard from the floor mid-game. The conversation looked heated. You could read Clark's face. Frustration, confusion, maybe anger. White looked defensive. the kind of body language someone has when they're trying to justify a decision they're not sure about. And then Clark went to the bench and something happened that nobody expected. The Atlanta Dream went on a 13-0 run in about 3 minutes. 13-0, just like that, no scored 20 breakdown or a missed shot or a bad call. It was a substitution, it was a coaching decision. Clark sat on the bench and watched it all happen in real time. She watched Atlanta go on that run. She watched the lineups that White had put on the floor get absolutely dismantled. She watched the ball move slower without her. She watched the tempo drop. She watched everything that was working in the first half get replaced with something that wasn't working at all, and she couldn't do anything about it. She was powerless. Just sitting there on the bench watching her team fall apart because the person who controlled minutes and offensive flow had made a substitution that looked, with every passing second, more and more wrong. You could see the frustration building on her face in real time. On the bench during those possessions where Atlanta was scoring, she was trying to communicate. She was arguing with the coaching staff, not yelling unprofessionally or being disrespectful, but clearly, visibly expressing that something was fundamentally wrong with the decisions being made. She was trying to talk to Austin Kelly repeatedly, not to White but to Kelly, because it had become obvious that White wasn't going to listen to her directly. She was trying to make a point, trying to communicate something crucial about what was happening on the floor and why it was falling apart. And cameras caught something that told you everything about the dynamic in that moment. Clark was looking directly at her coach, trying to make her point, trying to communicate something important about what was happening on the floor. And White was literally looking away. She was avoiding eye contact with her star player. She was refusing to engage, and if you know anything about body language, you know what that means. When a coach won't make eye contact with their best player who's trying to communicate during a game, it doesn't mean the coach is confident in their decision. It means the coach knows they're wrong. It means the coach is uncomfortable. It means the coach is defensive about the choice they've made. By the time White finally put Clark back in, the game was essentially over. Atlanta had control. Indiana's players were playing scared, terrified about picking up more fouls. Aliyah Boston was on the bench with 5 fouls, unable to protect the paint and unable to help defensively. The lineups that had been on the floor without Clark hadn't just failed. They'd actively harmed the team. They'd set Indiana back, and Clark's return couldn't fix the damage that had already been done in those crucial third quarter minutes when the game shifted. Clark ended up with 26 points and 7 assists for the night. For most players, that would be a career night. That would be something to be proud of. For a generational talent on pace for 52 points in the first quarter, for someone operating at the level Clark was in that opening 12 minutes, it was a disappointing finish. Not because she played badly in the second half. She didn't, but because she played the second half without the offensive weapons and support systems that had made the first quarter so explosive and so special. This wasn't just a substitution. This wasn't a normal coaching decision made in the flow of a game. This was the moment where Indiana's coaching staff made a choice that would define not just this game, but the entire season's narrative moving forward. This was the moment where a young superstar realized that her coach might not be aligned with winning in the way she understood winning. This was the moment where the real conflict started brewing underneath the surface, becoming visible to anyone paying attention. The thing about sitting on the bench during a 13-0 run is that you have time to think. You have time to process what's happening. You have time to understand that the decision your coach made didn't just cost you some points. It cost your team the momentum. It cost your team the game. It cost your team a chance to make a statement. And Clark, sitting there, was processing all of it in real time while being completely unable to do anything about it. She wasn't just frustrated. Pulling her during a scoring run, during a quarter where Atlanta was the one losing momentum, was the wrong move. And she had to sit there and watch the consequences play out in real time while being completely unable to do anything about it except try to communicate with the coaching staff and hope they'd listen. The cameras caught her trying to get Kelly's attention, trying to say something, anything, to communicate what was happening. And you could see the frustration growing as she realized that the coaching staff wasn't really listening. They were making their decisions and executing their substitutions and managing the game according to White's system, not according to what was actually working on the floor, not according to what the basketball was telling them. And then there was that moment where Clark was looking directly at her coach, trying to make eye contact, trying to have a conversation, trying to communicate that something was wrong. And White was literally looking away, not making eye contact, avoiding the conversation, refusing to engage. That's not the body language of a coach who's confident in their decision. That's the body language of someone who knows they made a mistake and doesn't want to admit it. That's the body language of someone who's defensive about a choice they're not sure about. When coaches avoid eye contact with their best players during timeouts or on the sideline during close games, it usually means one of two things. Either the coach thinks their player is in the wrong, or the coach has checked out mentally. They've stopped engaging with the reality of what's happening on the court and they're just going through the motions with their system. In this case, with the game still close and Atlanta making a run, the only real interpretation was that White had made a decision and she wasn't willing to second-guess it, even as evidence mounted that it was the wrong call. The damage being done was visible. Indiana's players were collapsing defensively without Clark. The ball movement was dying, the pace was slowing, the entire structure of what was working fell apart, and wasn't listening to her concerns. To understand why White made the decision to pull Clark and why she pulled her at that specific moment, you need to understand Stephanie White's coaching philosophy, because this isn't a random substitution. This is a coaching decision that stems from a specific approach to the game, a specific belief system about how basketball should be played and what matters most in winning. Stephanie White has talked extensively about her 3A's philosophy: awareness, anticipation, defense. In interviews, in coaching clinics, and press conferences, she's explained how this framework is supposed to work. It's built on solid basketball principles. It's designed to create structure. It sounds good on paper. It sounds like the foundation of something real and sustainable. It sounds like the kind of principled approach that builds winning cultures over time. It sounds like something that could work. But here's the thing: that philosophy is built for a specific type of team. It's designed for a grinding, defensive-minded squad. It's constructed to manage games, to control pace, to rely on discipline and structure, and everyone understanding their role within a strict system. It prioritizes organization over chaos. It values consistency over explosive play. It's the coaching philosophy of someone who believes deeply that offense wins games, but defense and discipline win championships. And in many basketball contexts, that's absolutely correct. That philosophy has merit. That philosophy has won games at different levels. The problem: this roster has Caitlin Clark, and Caitlin Clark isn't a player who thrives when she's being managed. She's not someone who produces at her highest level when her minutes are controlled or her possessions are limited or her role is constrained into a specific box on the court. Caitlin Clark is built to create. She's built to accelerate. She's built to make decisions in space before defenses can recover from them. She's a transition player. She's a playmaker. She's someone who needs freedom to operate. She needs space to move. She needs the offense to be built around her instincts and her ability to read the floor. You don't build your entire offensive system around limiting ball movement and managing minutes when your point guard is dropping 13 points in 12 minutes of a single quarter and reading the defense perfectly on every single possession. That's not optimization. That's handicapping your best player. That's like having a Ferrari and insisting on driving it at 30 miles an hour because you're worried about gas mileage. Technically, yes, you'll use less gas. But you're not actually using the vehicle for what it was designed to do. You're preventing it from doing what it's built to do. The lineups that White ran after pulling Clark in the third quarter didn't space the floor better than what was working. They didn't create matchup advantages that Indiana could exploit. If anything, they created more problems than they solved. Atlanta's interior players started absolutely dominating the glass because nobody Indiana had out there could match their size or strength effectively. The offense stalled out almost immediately because Clark wasn't there to create anything. Ball movement died, pace died, everything that had been working in the first half went away like someone flipped a switch. The three-guard look that White kept going back to throughout the game was supposed to create spacing. That was the theory, supposed to spread Atlanta's defense. Supposed to open up driving lanes. Instead, it created confusion. Players didn't know where to cut, possessions didn't flow, the rhythm that had existed when Clark was running the offense was completely gone, and by the time White put her back in, the game was already lost. The momentum had shifted, Indiana was playing scared, Atlanta had confidence. The window had closed. White's philosophy isn't wrong in a vacuum, it's just not right for this specific situation. Applied to this specific roster with this specific player, it's not just suboptimal, it's actively counterproductive. It's asking Clark to operate within constraints that go against her natural instincts and her actual strengths. It's asking her to be a system player when she's actually a system unto herself. It's asking her to fit into a box when she's the kind of talent that should reshape how everyone else fits around her instead. The first quarter showed what an offense looks like when it's built around Clark's strengths instead of trying to minimize them. Fast, spread out, finding open players before the defense can recover, pushing pace, creating advantages through speed and decision-making rather than through set plays and structure. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't baroque or intricate or complex. It was simple and explosive and completely effective. The second half showed what an offense looks like when those principles get abandoned. Slower, more structured, more reliant on individual players making difficult shots rather than the offense creating easy ones. It looked like a coach trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and it didn't work because the peg wasn't actually square. It was built to be round. It was designed to move quickly. It was meant to operate in space. It was built for someone like Caitlin Clark. And here's what makes it worse. Clark clearly understands all of this. She knows what works. She knows what doesn't work. She can feel when the offense is flowing and when it's stalling. She can sense when the pace is right and when it's been artificially slowed down. She's not just playing basketball, she's reading it. She's understanding it at a level that most players, even most professionals, don't reach. She's operating at a level where she understands the game better than some coaches understand it. Which is exactly why she was so frustrated on that bench. It wasn't that she didn't understand what White was trying to do. It was that she understood it perfectly, and she understood that it wasn't working. She understood that the coaching decision was making things harder, not easier. She understood that pulling her during a scoring run was the wrong move. And she had to sit there and watch the consequences play out while being unable to do anything about it, except try to communicate with the coaching staff. Let's talk about Aliyah Boston because her situation in this game tells you something incredibly important about how the entire night was managed from a coaching perspective. Her foul trouble didn't just hurt Indiana's defense. It didn't just put her in compromised situations where she had to play cautiously and hesitantly. Her foul trouble fundamentally gutted Indiana's entire offensive and defensive game plan. And a lot of that comes back to coaching decisions and how White managed the crisis when it emerged. Boston picked up her third foul before halftime even finished. That's early enough in a game that it should set off alarm bells for any coaching staff. When your best interior defender, the anchor of your defense, gets 3 fouls before the break, you're looking at a situation where you have to adjust your entire approach for the rest of the game. You have to be more careful with how you use her. You have to accept that there's going to be a stretch where she's playing with less aggression than ideal because she's 1 or 2 fouls away from sitting down entirely and being unable to protect your interior. In the second quarter, after picking up that third foul, Boston played cautious and hesitant. She should have been physical and aggressive. She should have been battling Atlanta's forwards and centers and establishing herself in the post. That's her role. That's what she does when she's playing at full intensity. But with 3 fouls already against her name and the refs calling the game loosely, she had to pull back. She had to be more careful. She had to second-guess herself on every possession. She had to be less aggressive because the cost of a foul was too high. Then she fouled out with 5 fouls, playing only 22 minutes total in a game where Atlanta's interior presence was absolutely dominating the paint. 22 minutes isn't enough for your best interior defender in a game where you need her most. And that's not because Boston was playing recklessly or making poor decisions. That's because the officiating was inconsistent and because White didn't fight for her when it mattered. Here's the moment that crystallizes the whole problem. Late in the third quarter, Boston picked up her 5th foul. The play looked marginal to basically everyone watching. The contact was incidental. It was the kind of play that happens 100 times in every game without getting called. 2 players jostling for position and one of them ends up with a foul. Boston was defending as she should have been defending. Atlanta was attacking as they should have been attacking, and somehow the whistle came anyway. At that moment, Stephanie White had multiple options in front of her. She could have called a timeout and discussed the play with Boston. She could have burned a challenge and fought for her best player. She had a challenge available. She had the ability to contest the call officially. She could have gone to the refs and said something. That's what coaching is sometimes. It's fighting for your players. It's advocating for them when officials might be getting it wrong. It's using your resources to protect them from unfair calls or inconsistent officiating. White didn't do that. She sat there, she watched Boston foul out, and she handed Atlanta a free path to the basket for most of the fourth quarter. Boston was the only player Indiana had with the size and strength to battle Atlanta's interior players consistently. With her on the bench, Atlanta's forwards and centers started eating. They were getting offensive rebounds, they were finishing through contact, they were establishing themselves in the post without any real resistance. The paint became open season. This is what separates good coaching from bad coaching. It's not about complex X's and O's or having the most innovative plays in your playbook. It's about managing situations in real time. It's about protecting your players. It's about understanding when to fight for them and when to accept reality. And in this case, White just accepted it. She gave up on that challenge. She let Boston's 5th foul stand without questioning it. And she handed Atlanta's interior players the game on a silver platter. Someone watching the game made a really important observation. Whenever you see a coach accept a bad call on a key player's foul without challenging it, it usually means one of 2 things. Either the coach thinks their player actually made a mistake or committed the foul, or the coach has given up on the game mentally. They've stopped fighting, they've stopped trying to win, they're just going through the motions. In this case, with the game still close and plenty of basketball left to play, the only interpretation available was giving up. That decision changed everything about what happened in the fourth quarter. Indiana was suddenly playing without their most important interior presence. Atlanta was suddenly playing without real resistance inside. The paint became a free-for-all where Atlanta's players could do basically whatever they wanted because nobody was there to stop them with size or strength or defensive presence. And any small lead Indiana might have had evaporated completely because they couldn't protect the rim. Boston isn't just an interior defender, she's an interior presence. She's someone whose very existence on the floor changes how other teams attack and where they're willing to go with their offense. When she's on the floor, Atlanta has to be careful. When she's off the floor, Atlanta gets aggressive. They start throwing their weight around. They start attacking the paint because they know there's nobody there who can challenge them physically. This is the part of the story where you have to look at the numbers first, then look at the tape, and then understand how officiating can genuinely change the outcome of a game. Indiana committed 29 fouls in this game. Atlanta committed fewer, and the free throw disparity that resulted from those foul calls was absolutely brutal. Atlanta shot 31 free throws, Indiana shot 21. That's a 10 free throw difference. Not close, not even in the same universe. In a game that Indiana lost by 17 points, 10 free throw attempts is absolutely significant. That's potentially 20 points of difference depending on how they were converted. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story. You have to actually watch what was being called and what wasn't being called. You have to see the pattern emerge because there definitely was a pattern. It was consistent, it was obvious, and it was incredibly one-sided. The pattern went like this. Caitlin Clark drives hard to the rim. She absorbs contact from an Atlanta defender, contact that's real, contact that clearly impacts the shot attempt, contact that any objective observer would call a foul, and the whistle stays quiet, nothing, no foul call, no free throws. Clark just has to convert the shot while being hit. Meanwhile, an Atlanta guard pulls up for a jumper, barely touched by an Indiana player, barely even brushed by incidental contact, and it's an automatic foul call. Whistle, 2 shots every single time, over and over this pattern repeated. Atlanta's interior players grabbed Indiana shooters, literally grabbed them, held them off their spots, pushed them away from rebounds, and there was no whistle. Silence. But when Indiana tried to match that physicality, tried to play at the same intensity level, tried to defend with the same aggression, the refs were right there with the whistle ready. It created this bizarre dynamic where Atlanta could play one kind of game and Indiana had to play a completely different one. Angel Reese specifically played the most physical game she's played all year, throwing her body around on the glass, fighting for position in the paint, battling for every rebound. And the refs rewarded her for it on one end while completely ignoring the exact same behavior on the other end when Indiana tried to do the same thing. You could watch Reese body Indiana's players without getting called, and then you could watch an Indiana player make the slightest contact with Reese and get whistled for a foul immediately. Here's a specific example that frustrated everyone watching. Caitlin Clark is being held, actually held, for seconds at a time. You can see it in the footage. Her arms are being grabbed, she's being pushed off her spot, she's being prevented from getting to where she needs to be, and nothing, no whistle. The refs are just letting it go, but then Clark drives and there's barely any contact, barely, and suddenly it's being called against her. It doesn't make sense except for the fact that there's clearly a bias operating, clearly a pattern. Another moment that stands out. Kelsey Mitchell goes up for a layup and gets pulled from behind. Her hand hits Angel Reese in the face during the contact. That's an obvious foul on Mitchell. If we're being technical, it's hitting someone in the face. And she gets a technical foul called against her for it. That's harsh, but you could make an argument that if you hit someone in the face, you deserve to get called. You deserve some consequence. But then Angel Reese goes up for a layup and elbows somebody, not lightly brushes them, elbows them directly, and it's not the first time she's done something similar in recent games. That's her 3rd time doing something similar in 2 games, and there's nothing, no upgrade, no technical, no accountability. It's just allowed like it never happened. This kind of inconsistency doesn't happen by accident. You don't accidentally call 31 free throws for one team and 21 for the other if you're actually trying to officiate fairly and impartially. You don't accidentally let one team play physical while penalizing the other team for the exact same behavior. That's a choice. That's a pattern. That's what happens when the officials have decided early that one team is going to be allowed to be more physical than the other. One team is going to get the benefit of the doubt, and the other team is going to be called for everything. And here's what makes it worse in this specific game. Indiana's best player is the one getting no calls. Clark is driving into defenders and absorbing contact that would send any Atlanta guard to the free throw line without a second thought, and she's getting nothing. She's putting up 26 points in this game without ever getting to the free throw line, without being rewarded for playing aggressively and attacking. She's doing all the work and getting none of the calls. Meanwhile, Atlanta is getting every call that goes even slightly their way. By the 4th quarter, Indiana's entire team was playing scared. They were terrified of picking up fouls. You could see it in how they defended. They were playing tentative. They were playing timid. They weren't being aggressive because they all knew one more whistle could send them to the bench. They knew one more foul could end their game, and that fear changes everything about how you approach a game. It changes how physical you're willing to be. It changes whether you're willing to take a charge or fight through a screen or challenge a shot at the rim. Atlanta wasn't playing under that same constraint because the officials gave them room to be physical without consequences. They could be aggressive. They could throw their bodies around. They could play the kind of defense and the kind of physical game that wins basketball games. And they did it knowing that the refs had their back, knowing that they weren't going to get called for being too physical or too aggressive. This is what people mean when they talk about the refs constructing a blowout. It's not that they were doing it intentionally, sitting in the locker room before the game and deciding to help Atlanta win. It's that they called the game in a specific way, noticed that one team was benefiting from that approach, and then continued calling it that way because the pattern had been set. That consistency turned into momentum, turned into confidence for one team, turned into fear for the other, and turned a 14-point halftime deficit that looked relatively close into a 17-point final margin that looked inevitable. Here's something interesting that a lot of people didn't talk about after this game but absolutely deserves to be discussed. Indiana's starting rotation massively underperformed while their bench actually showed up with something real to offer, something meaningful, something that contradicts the narrative about how the team should be constructed. Lexi Hull is out there as one of Indiana's starting guards, and she basically went through an offensive drought that covered pretty much the entire game. Never got anything going, never really threatened Atlanta's defense in any meaningful way. Possessions where she had the ball, nothing happened. She wasn't creating for teammates. She wasn't scoring efficiently. She wasn't doing the things you need a starter to do at a high level, and that's not unique to this game. It's been a pattern for Hull lately. Her efficiency has been down. Her creation has been inconsistent. Her impact has been smaller than you'd want from someone starting next to your best player. But in a game where you need your starters to show up and deliver, Hull didn't deliver. She didn't show up. She was out there and then she wasn't making plays, and that's a problem. Then there's Monique Billings, who signed real money this offseason. Billings picked up fouls early and spent critical minutes on the bench without making any kind of impact before she basically sat for the rest of the game. She was unable to stay on the floor, unable to contribute. In a game where you're losing and you need everyone to contribute something, Billings contributed almost nothing. She was out there and then she was fouling, and then she was sitting, and that's not the return on investment that Indiana was expecting when they gave her that contract. Two players with significant money deals, two players who were supposed to be part of the solution, combined for almost nothing. And Indiana desperately needed both of them to be better, needed them to step up. Needed them to produce, but they didn't, they couldn't, or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, the production wasn't there. In a blowout loss, you can excuse role players for struggling. You can say, well, sometimes basketball is like that, sometimes you just get beat. Sometimes the other team is better that night. But in a game that was actually close for a significant portion of it, in a game that Indiana had chances to win, in a game that was winnable until the third quarter imploded, those contributions matter. They matter a lot, and they didn't show up. Now here's where it gets interesting. Off the bench, 3 different players actually showed up with something real to offer, starting with Sophie Cunningham. She finished with 13 points and hit 3 of her 8 three-point attempts, so she was efficient. She was getting her shots off. But it's not just the numbers, it was the energy. She brought physical energy that the starting lineup just wasn't generating. She competed hard on every single possession. She got after it defensively. She was fighting for loose balls. She was diving for steals. She was giving Indiana something tangible to work with, something real to build around in certain stretches, something that mattered. Miesha Hins-Allen gave Indiana interior presence while Aliyah Boston was battling foul trouble or sitting on the bench entirely with that 5th foul. Hins-Allen finished around the basket in ways Boston couldn't manage in this specific game. She was stronger in certain situations. She was tougher. She was willing to battle for position in ways that matched what Atlanta was doing in the paint. And while she couldn't do it for extended stretches without fouling herself, whenever she was on the floor, she made a difference. She made plays. She protected the rim. Then there's Raven Johnson, the young guard coming off the bench. Johnson pushed pace when Indiana needed it most. She made smart decisions with the basketball. She kept Indiana from falling apart completely during the stretches when the starters were struggling or getting benched or playing tentatively because of foul trouble. She's not a scorer. She's not going to put up big points and fill up the stat sheet. But she did things right. She made reads. She understood the game. She moved the ball. She knew when to push and when to be patient. Here's what should terrify White, what should make her really uncomfortable. Cunningham alone outscored Lexi Hull and Monique Billings combined, not by a little bit, significantly. And she did it while playing fewer minutes than either of them. So it's not like Hull and Billings were playing 40 minutes and Cunningham was coming in for garbage time. Cunningham was on the floor less, she had fewer opportunities, and she got more done with the time she had. That's not coincidence. That's a rotation problem. That's a structural issue with how White is managing her roster. That's a sign that the players who are actually making an impact on the game, Cunningham, Hins-Allen, Johnson, those are the ones coming off the bench. And the players who are supposed to be cornerstones of this team's offense, Hull, Billings, those are the ones struggling to find their place within the system. Part of that is the system itself. Cunningham thrives in an up-tempo, physical, aggressive style of play. Give her the ball on a break and she knows what to do. She can move, she can finish, she can make plays, get her defending in space and she'll compete, she'll battle. That's who she is as a player. She's built for fast basketball. The system that White is running, the slow it down, control the pace, manage your offense approach that doesn't highlight Cunningham's strengths. It hides them. It keeps her on the bench waiting for opportunities that don't come often enough. It prevents her from playing the kind of basketball she's built to play. It constrains her. But the fact that she's so effective when she gets on the floor suggests that maybe the system is the problem, not the players, not Cunningham, not Hins-Allen, not Johnson. Maybe the issue is that White is trying to use a formula that doesn't fit the talent she has available. Maybe the answer is to adjust the system, not to keep benching the players who are actually producing. And that's exactly what Cunningham was thinking about during this game. Not that she's not playing enough, though she probably should be, but that she knows she can help. She wants to help. And she's only getting limited opportunities because White has decided on a starting rotation and a system that doesn't maximize what this team's best available players can actually do. That doesn't work with the talent she has. That forces everyone into boxes they don't fit into. Hall and Billings were brought in to do things, to contribute, to be part of winning. If the system doesn't allow them to do those things, if it constrains them, if it prevents them from operating at their best level, then either the players are wrong for the system or the system is wrong for these players. And based on what we saw in this game, Cunningham's performance compared to theirs suggests that maybe the system is the problem. Maybe if White was willing to adjust her approach, to lean into faster play, to lean into Cunningham's physicality, to build the offense around Clark's ability to create in space. Maybe if she did those things, then her bench players would have a better chance to succeed when they came in. But right now, she's forcing her starting rotation to operate within constraints that don't suit them. And then she's wondering why her best available players are coming off the bench. When Caitlin Clark finally opened her mouth in that post-game press conference, nobody really knew what was coming. She hadn't blown up on the court, she hadn't made a huge scene during the game, she just sat on the bench and watched, visibly frustrated, clearly angry but contained, keeping it professional, maintaining composure even though you could read her emotions on her face. So when she started talking, cameras were all ears, reporters were paying attention. Everyone was waiting to see what she'd actually say, waiting to hear if she was going to directly criticize her coach or if she was going to keep it diplomatic and measured. She didn't blow up, she kept it professional, but the words she chose told the whole story. The subtext was impossible to miss. She talked about what the team did well in the first half, she talked about transition basketball, she talked about spraying the ball around, she talked about finding open people, she talked about moving fast. She talked about winning through pace and spacing. That's the language of someone who understands how this offense is supposed to function. That's the language of someone who knows exactly what works and what doesn't work when she's running the offense. And then she described what happened in the second half with one sentence that basically indicted everything that came after the third quarter substitution. It's really hard to do that when all we do is foul and they score. Think about what she just said. She said the team did good things in the first half. Transition, spacing, open players, finding rhythm, and then in the second half all they did was foul and give up free throws, and because of that, because of the refs and the fouls, they didn't play transition basketball anymore. They couldn't, the pace changed, the approach changed, everything changed. She wasn't naming White directly. She wasn't saying my coach made a bad substitution on camera. But every single person in that room understood what she was really saying. The shift away from transition basketball, the shift away from what was working, wasn't something Clark did. It wasn't something the team did, it was something that got done to them. It was a coaching decision that changed the entire approach and killed everything that was effective. It was a choice made by the coaching staff that had direct consequences on what the team could and couldn't do. Clark was staying measured. She was choosing her words carefully. She was making sure not to cross a line into disrespecting her coach or being unprofessional, but she was also not pretending that the second half just happened organically. She was not pretending that the collapse was some mysterious thing that nobody could explain. She was directly pointing out that the coaches changed the approach. And that change is what allowed Atlanta back into the game. That change is what killed the momentum. That's a direct criticism of the coaching staff, delivered in a way that's professional enough to not cross a line, but clear enough that nobody in that room misunderstands what she's saying. Nobody can pretend she's not criticizing the coaching decisions. Then Sophie Cunningham backed her up, and here's where things got more intense, because Cunningham doesn't cushion things the way Clark does. Where Clark stayed measured and chose her words carefully, Cunningham spoke directly about competing. About what winning actually requires from this team, about the approach on the floor, about doing things the right way, about physical intensity and effort. The room got quieter when Cunningham talked because she wasn't being diplomatic and everyone could feel it. She wasn't sugarcoating her message. She's been one of the most physically competitive players on Indiana's roster all season. She's played with an edge, she's brought intensity, she's brought a willingness to battle that's made a difference. And the system that White runs doesn't always reward that intensity. It doesn't always highlight players who want to play fast and physical. It doesn't always value the things that Cunningham brings to the table. And Cunningham was sitting there in a post-game press conference with her coach right there, basically saying out loud that something's wrong with how the team is being managed. Not attacking anyone, not being disrespectful. But saying it clearly enough that anyone paying attention understands the message. She's been physically competitive, she's brought what she can bring, and the results on the floor show that something's not working about how the team is structured. She's not blaming Clark, she's not blaming her teammates, she's pointing at the system, she's pointing at approach, she's pointing at choices being made above the player level. Those are coaching decisions, that's what White is responsible for. White sat there. The cameras caught all of it, and what White said in response landed completely flat next to what Clark and Cunningham had just put on the table. Completely flat. White's response sounded defensive. It sounded like someone trying to explain away criticism instead of actually addressing it, instead of acknowledging that maybe something needs to change. And the gap between what the players said and what White said told you more than any quote could. Because here's the thing, if White came back and said something like, you know what, they're right, the second half approach wasn't working, we're going to adjust, we're going to figure this out. That would be one thing. That would suggest that the coach is willing to listen and willing to change. That would suggest humility and flexibility, but that's not what happened. White got defensive. White tried to explain. White defended her decisions instead of considering whether maybe her players had a point. And that told everyone watching that this conflict isn't going away by itself. This wasn't just a moment of frustration that's going to get hashed out in a locker room meeting. This was them reaching a breaking point. This was them saying on camera in front of millions of people that they've had enough. People who have watched this team all season weren't surprised by any of it. They'd already seen Clark's frustration building on the sideline during those third quarter substitutions. Already seen Cunningham bring fire and competitiveness that the system keeps failing to use properly. Already watched Indiana run lineups that made no sense in close games while their best player watched from the bench. Already noticed the patterns, already understood what was happening. The postgame didn't reveal anything new to people paying close attention. It just confirmed it on camera with quotes, with footage of their body language and their tone, with a record that can't be erased or forgot. And once something like that is confirmed on camera with quotes, with footage of their frustration and their tone, it becomes part of the narrative. It becomes something that people can point to. It becomes evidence of a real problem, evidence that this isn't just media speculation or fans overanalyzing. This is players, real players on the team, saying that something's wrong. And that's dangerous for White because now there's a record of her players publicly questioning her coaching. And that kind of thing has consequences, real consequences.